And we're live. And I heard literally a second before we went live that there is no cactus today. And the missing
Sorry.
cactus, we will resolve the mystery of the missing cactus before the end of the show. It is Monday. It is February 24th, the year of our Lord 2025. A day that will live in infamy. It is the third anniversary of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation. But on the bright side, you see, on the one hand, you have 3 years of genocidal invasion. On the other hand, the bright side is that we got a podcast out of it. And that podcast is dropping today. I will leave it to y'all to decide, is the genocide worth it, so that Lawfare and Goat Rodeo can team up, make a kick-ass podcast. We're going to talk about all about Escalation. We have Max Johnston here. He is the dude who actually, every podcast has a host. In this case, the podcast has two hosts. Every podcast has some jerk in the background, in this case me, who kind of raises the money or, thinks he has an idea or something. But then there's the guy who actually makes the podcast. And whenever Lawfare and Goat Rodeo work together, that's the Goat Rodeo person. And whenever we do a really cool project, that's usually Max. Because Max is a super, super talented radio producer who takes stories and turns them into figures out how to tell them as stories, and figures out a soundscape for them, and figures out how to beat unruly talent into submission, and so they behave themselves. So we're just going to talk to Max. But first, guys, we're not allowed to have fun anymore because fucking Proud Boys keep showing up to make sure we don't have fun. And while the cactus isn't here today, Holly is. Tell us a little bit about what happened to her over the weekend and her encounter with Enrique Tarrio. I was not invited to the principal's first
I invited you. I
conference
mean,
this weekend.
I'm nobody, but I invited you.
Yeah, but you didn't have invite authority. Um, and I was not invited. I think it's because I have no principles. But I'm not sure. It may be because I was busy with projecting on Russian diplomatic facilities. But Holly, I hear you had some unwanted visitors. Tell us about what happened this weekend.
Well, first of all, more importantly, I met at the conference in person the estimable Laura Donna, and
I met her
who
at
was,
two projections too.
yes, I told her to go. I was supposed to go the one last night, and unfortunately, I was too exhausted by my ordeals to make it. But she made it, so she's a better American than I am. Anyway, so that was great. The cactus, by the way, is marooned in, we have a guest. My office is also the guest room. And so when we have a guest, I have no office. I'm in my husband's office, which I have pillaged for furniture. And so it's looking rather terrible. But the cactus is in the guest room with the sleeping guest, and I'm not disturbing the guest to get the cactus. So that's where the
But Holly, if the cactus were here, what would he say?
The cactus, maybe I should do an impression of the cactus. Cactus, you're watching Dog Shirt TV
All right,
and
let's
effing
do it.
revolution in morning television.
It is an effing revolution in morning television, because where else could you watch a very confused Goat Rodeo producer engaging with a former CIA analyst about the subject of Enrique Tarrio's interruptions at the principal's first meeting this weekend. Holly, I interrupted you. Please go ahead.
No, no, that's okay. I hadn't gotten to the story yet. Yes, so I was a volunteer for the conference this weekend, which was amazing. It was about three, almost not quite three times the size. It was definitely double the size of last year's. So a lot of interest. It was in a much bigger venue as well at the JW Marriott.
And,
Um,
and for those who
and
don't
as
know, what is Principles First, other than a
um, it,
society that
it was
excludes
started
people
just
like me who don't have principles?
maybe I can. I thought you should be there, Ben. But anyway, I don't. I'm a peon.
I was
I'm
there
not
2 years ago,
anybody.
but then apparently they didn't like me, so they didn't invite me back last year. They didn't
No,
invite me
no, Ben.
this year, and Holly, my feelings are hurt.
When I run the world, you'll be in charge of everything. So yeah, you'll
That
be
sounds
my
great.
Elon Musk. I will be Trump, and you'll be Elon Musk.
Do I
I don't
get a
really want to be
chainsaw?
Trump, but anyway. Nonetheless, I'll start painting my face orange and I'll pretend to be Trump. Okay, so Principles First was started by just a private citizen, a lawyer named Heath Mayo, several years ago. He is, I think, a former Republican, and most of the sort of early founders and participants were kind of the Bulwark Dispatch crowd, the never Trump Republicans. But it's expanded, and now it's basically a general pro-democracy conference. Very, very harmless, very nerdy, no weaponry involved except for just powerful brains. And Heath Mayo, not Keith Mayo, Heath with a H. And he's just an attorney from, I think he lives in Dallas now.
Yeah, good guy.
Um, so yeah, great guy, and it's just gotten bigger every year. And yeah, so a lot of your usual favorite suspects from the Bulwark, and Frank Figluzzi was there, and Asha Rangappa was there, and all the Bulwark folks were there. Gary Kasparov was there. I'm trying to think who else. Anyway, very esteemed group of people. George Conway and his dog were there. I met Clyde, who is lovely,
A
and
corgi, of course.
I asked one of the my fellow volunteers. I'm like, is Clyde a service dog? How is George just coming in? He also came into. We had a reception, and he just walked into the restaurant with the dog. And I said, is that a service dog? Can George just walk in anywhere with that dog? And my volunteer says George can do anything he wants. So that's true, but anyway, yes, a lot of esteemed panelists. And then also for, I think every year, at least for the past 3 years that I've been there, the Capitol police officers, Michael Fanone, Harry Dunn, Aquilino Ganell, and Daniel Hodges, some combination or all of them have been there. They have been honored with awards in the past, and another one got an award this year. They're basically running through all of them, I think. Got a Profiles in Courage award. Aquilino Ganell got it this year. And yeah, so they were there again. They did a very powerful panel that happened to occur just after Enrique Tarrio showed up with some of his goons. I'm hearing we're not allowed to call them the Proud Boys anymore because a court gave that name to an African American church in a lawsuit. So the artists formerly known as Proud Boys arrived with Enrique Tarrio fresh off.
Boys be not proud.
Yeah. Fresh off his latest arrest, his new and improved criminal charge on Friday night, he and the estimable Stuart Rose of the Oath Keepers, and I think we can still call them the Oath Keepers, on Friday night apparently assaulted a woman on Capitol Hill, on Capitol grounds, unfortunately. So another federal charge that I'm sure will mysteriously disappear. But yeah, fresh off his latest arrest, I guess he bonded out. I don't know. Because he showed up on Saturday to harass Michael Fanone and his like 80-year-old mother. Apparently, they have repeatedly harassed his mother and other family members. They particularly hate Michael Fanone. Not sure why they've really targeted, but they've all been targeted. All the officers have been targeted. And so they tried to get in the conference and got close to it before security intervened. But in the meantime, there's video on the internet of them getting in Michael Fanone's face, who, frankly, I would not mess with Michael Fanone. Have you met him? Have you seen, like, not all,
I've never met him in person, but you know, I am like 15 years trained in martial arts, and when you do that, whenever you see somebody, you do a kind of visual head to toe. Could I take this person? And it's just an instinct that you learn
I'm,
when studying
and
martial arts.
no,
And Michael Fanone, no.
yeah, I
I've
was going to say
done the
no,
Vladimir Putin scan. I'm totally good handling Vladimir Putin. I would not mess with Michael Fanone.
right.
He is
He's
a
big,
very
he's in
he,
shape, and he's pissed off. I mean,
yeah,
he is powered by
and he's trained.
high
He
caliber
knows how
anger.
to throw a punch. He's like you don't want to fuck with that guy.
No. And
Um,
so there's a video of him. I don't, honestly, I don't, I'm sure he must have incredible restraint because I would have pounded this guy, I mean, long ago. But he just basically, they called security and got rid of Enrico Tario and his friends. And then Michael Fanone and the officers like immediately came onto the stage. And I'm telling you, the others were, angry, but Michael Fanone was just like, I think because his mother was there and they had messed with his mother yet again. And I think that would piss a guy off. Um, so yeah, that happened Saturday. And then I did not see it, but I heard it, they talked about it and I heard about it and I saw the anger that, the residual anger in the aftermath. But then Sunday, around noon, an announcement went out. Everybody cleared the floor like immediately, and it was quite the chaotic scene because we had about 1,200 people in the bottom of the ballroom floor of the JW Marriott, which is like 2 levels down from the lobby. And they cleared that floor, and then they cleared the floor above, and they gathered us all in like an area of the lobby and didn't really know what was going on. And waited, and then it was swarmed with police, dogs. Clyde was of no use, I have to say. Like the police
yeah, you
dog,
don't want a corgi.
yeah, the police
There are
dog
no
pushed
bomb sniffing
Clyde out of the
corgis.
way,
Yeah.
and Clyde was not involved in clearing the bomb threat. So
And
Clyde,
is
I
it
don't know.
clear that the bomb threat came from Proud Boys?
So what they said, and I went to the press conference afterwards, was oh, it wasn't just the venue. It was also Michael Fanone's home and his mother's home that were threatened in the bomb threat. And Jim Acosta got the actual text of the threat and
Right.
put it online, so you can see what it was. It's lengthy and it's deranged. It came from an address that was sort of cloaked or obscured or whatever. But I mean, the front piece was E Tario, so I mean,
So
to me it was clear.
here's my question though. Do you have confidence, Holly Berkeley Fletcher, that the FBI under Kash Patel and our new deputy FBI director Dan Bongino will investigate this bomb threat with against former law enforcement and his mother and a hotel facility in Washington D.C. with the vigor that we might expect as citizens of a thriving democracy?
I do not. However, given that this incident was on private property, I believe the MPD, the DC PD would be involved. That might help. And then also the other two incidents were in Virginia. So perhaps,
Yeah,
although
no,
Glenn Youngkin, yeah,
anytime you have a bomb threat,
that's the
that
FBI.
has any kind of phone or that's going to be presumptively Bureau, at least at some point, especially if it's a multi-state thing. Um, before we
In this
turn
case,
to
I have no confidence.
Max and escalation, let me just ask you, are you intimidated? Are you going to back off your work with Principles First because of these dangerous threats, or are you going to charge on and say, Enrique Chario, bring it the f on because the cactus will
Absolutely.
kick your ass?
The cactus, I have the cactus, so I'm not really worried. And again, the cactus's history is mysterious and known only to myself and a few of
and
my
extremely violent.
superiors at the agency. Yeah, but I wouldn't, I have the cactus. I feel pretty comfortable about that. I wasn't really afraid. I figured it was a hoax, but to me, it was. However, as I was standing there, and by the way, incidentally, just by coincidence, I was standing with Michael Hayden, my former director, who's my favorite director of all the directors that I worked under,
He's a
and
wonderful
who
man.
is now who is confined in a wheelchair and has aphasia, has some trouble speaking. But we had people were coming up and saying hello to him, and I had a chat with him as well, and he stayed for the entire conference. I thought he might leave with the bomb threat just because, he's in a wheelchair and it's grueling. And I mean, it took over an hour to clear this. We were standing out there for an hour, and but he stayed for the whole conference, and yeah, was lovely and just very determined, you know, and concerned and angry, very angry. So
Yep.
it was really nice to see him. So I'm not deterred, but I did remember as we were standing there that wasn't there were real pipe bombs found on January 6th that they haven't ever identified who.
Two of them,
Remember
and they
that
have never solved the crime.
that's right. So
You
as I was
know,
standing there, I was kind of remembering that, and I was like, well, I think this is a hoax, but these people have clearly, or people like this have clearly planted bombs before. Ben, I hate to say it, but I think it's a matter of time before there is once again real political violence. And clearly these people have no, um, they don't care and they have no concerns for their being arrested because he was just arrested on Friday night. And then he shows back
yeah,
up on Saturday.
and he knows he can commit seditious conspiracy and not serve the time. So, why not? All of which
Yeah,
is a great transition
right.
to
And
Max Johnston, whose previous podcast series before Escalation was actually about a long unsolved terrorist attack against a most improbable conference target, which is to say, a conference in Chicago at a hotel involving furries.
Furries, yeah. I
Yeah, the
thought you were doing
show
a big dramatic pause.
look at that. Yeah, that's
The show
cool.
is called Fur and Loathing. It is spectacular, and I
Oh, I
have
know.
a really cool spoiler for you at the end of the show. Max kind of solves the crime. I wouldn't say 100%, but pretty close. Hello, Jonathan Rausch. Um, so, Max, say a couple words about Fur and Loathing because it's a perfect transition from Holly having a bomb scare at the principal's first conference to Escalation. I mean, sometimes God just drops one of these transitions in your lap, and it would be frankly irreligious to not observe it. So, talk for a minute about Escalation,
About Escalation or about Fur and Loathing?
Fur and Loathing.
So, Fur and Loathing is a true crime story unlike anything you've ever heard. It is about, as Ben mentioned, a chemical weapons attack at a hotel and convention center just outside of Chicago, which is happened at one of the largest conventions for the furry community. This event luckily didn't kill anyone, but could have been one of the most dangerous and deadly domestic terror incidents on U.S. soil. It to this day remains unsolved in a sort of formal sense. There's been no arrests or charges filed.
Max knows who did
But
it.
but if you listen to the podcast, which is 6 episodes streaming wherever you get your podcasts, you can get, I think, a pretty clear idea of what happened. And hopefully you can go on a pretty interesting and zany and colorful journey along the way. Super, super fun show. We're super, super proud of it. And still to this day remains one of the strangest things I've ever done. The situations that podcast forced me into, which you can hear in the show, are unlike anything else I've ever done. And you're right, Ben. This is a natural transition.
I mean, it is. So, how
Yeah.
did you go from uh, working on Fur and Loathing to working on a podcast series that is a history of post-Soviet US-Ukrainian relations.
I just love the difficult, thorny stuff. I love the mess. I love the muck. I love it when it's not pretty, when there's all sorts of contradictions. But really, I got to thank my employer, Goat Rodeo, which is sort of the podcast branch. You guys, the Lawfare audience, Ben's audience has heard Goat Rodeo in a million different fashions. But it's just lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time when both those opportunities came up. My specialty is in what I call national security nightmares. When things go wrong, when policies get all confusing, when allies are left behind. And so going from a show like Fur and Loathing, which is about, pretty gnarly potential domestic terror incident, to a show like Escalation, which is about the sort of 30-year chronicle of the US and Ukraine dating back to the end of the Cold War. I think there's a fair amount of overlap in some of those and how fraught those stories are, how tense they are, how much bad blood there is. Entirely different contexts. But Goat Rodeo is a lovely place, and they just throw me into the fire. And so I'm super stoked to talk about both these projects, and I'm super stoked to have Escalation now out in the world. Maybe not as similar to Fur and Loathing, but maybe still a little fun. We'll see.
So it is out there now. You can get it. We are launching it officially at Brookings this morning at 10, which means we're going to have to end right on time because both Max and I have to get to Brookings. I want to start by playing just a little excerpt of it. This is actually from the second episode, which is not out yet, but it's out in our hearts. And what we're going to do is we're going to I'm going to play a little episode here, a little excerpt, and then we're going to talk about it for a minute.
Beautiful.
Our American and Ukrainian perspectives clash and end up creating policy disagreements with huge ramifications. There's another moment like that in the mid-90s that casts a shadow over the two countries to this day. It's the story of an agreement that's less than 3 pages long. And much like the Chicken Kyiv speech, most Americans have never heard of it. But now, 30 years later, many Ukrainians hate it. It's the story of the Budapest Memorandum.
The Budapest Memorandum.
Budapest Memorandum.
Actually, the Budapest Memorandum
This
is
famous Budapest Memorandum.
The tension over the Budapest Memo is one of the things that brought those protesters to the White House. Marichka, the activist leading them, is bouncing around, talking to speakers and organizers. Marichka wasn't even born when the Budapest Memo was signed. But when we ask her about it, she takes time to stop and answer.
What do you think about the Budapest Memo?
Oh, I think it's a total fail, actually, I think. Oh my goodness. Like, we signed this document. Here, what we have right now. We have the war starting in 2014. We have annexation of Crimea, attack on eastern Ukraine, and then they are moving forward, and now they are able to attack.
Marichka talks about the Budapest Memo often, when she's leading demonstrations like this, or when she's talking to lawmakers about supporting Ukraine. She says the story of the Budapest Memo is a warning to all of us.
History is, going like a circle. And the only thing we need to think of right now is we need to actually learn how to learn from a history.
From Lawfare and Goat Rodeo, this is Escalation.
So that was actually not the excerpt I meant to play.
Still a good one.
But it's a good excerpt.
Well, and it includes the one moment of audible comedy in the show, which is Marichka saying, it's a total fail, actually, I think, which gets us to laugh every single time.
So I told Marichka 2 nights ago that excerpt was in the show, and she was
horrified,
faintly mortified, but amused. And then she paused and said, we were at a bar downtown, and she said, it really was a total fail.
She's so right.
Jonathan Rausch, how are you?
I am good. I'm here because this morning I published an Atlantic article, and I thought offer myself up to tell you about it today or on some future date if you're ever interested.
Well, we are always interested. Can we chat about it at the end of the show?
Sure, we can if you like, or I can come back at a different date. It's a pretty
No, 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 no,
substantial
no.
article
We
if
can
you
do
like.
like sort of like the like we've got some ground to cover with escalation, but we can do like the last 10 minutes of the show. Does that work?
That's fine if 10 minutes is what you want.
Well, we will start with that and move on to more as required.
I'm busy looking up fur and loathing, trying to find it. So I think I found it. I think it's on
It's
Goat Rodeo's website, but
That is true, and I don't think there's a ton of fur and loathings. So if you found one, it's probably the one. But I can also pass along some links.
so, Max, I want to, we have a lot of opportunity to talk to Nastia and Tyler about the story that we tell in this podcast, but I actually want to talk to you about like how you produce a show like this, because like Fur and Loathing, all right, I understand. It's you start with an investigation and then you like follow how the investigation didn't work and then you pick up the leads that I kind of understand the reporting process. But a show like this is it's 30 years of bilateral relations. It's the domestic politics of Ukraine about which people know nothing. It's the interaction of both the United States and Ukraine with Russia and through that prism with each other. How do you get your hands around that to tell a story that breaks down in a discrete number of episodes and is coherent rather than is, a slosh of information and opinions?
Right. I mean, that's the biggest challenge on any of the shows, but let alone a show like Escalation, which is covering such a broad swath of content, material, history. The big thing was, I mean, we knew going in that this story was going to have all the big picture implications that you had just mapped out, Ben. All the geopolitical implications, the foreign policy, the diplomacy, the intelligence, all that. What I tried to hone in on early was the simple fact that if you were to just line up the chronology between the United States and Ukraine starting in 1989, if you were just to line up the sequence of events that happens between these two countries, it is a remarkable list of things. If you think about the Chicken Kiev speech, which is in the first episode that we feature, which is sort of this cynical speech that President George H.W. Bush gives in Kiev at the very end of the Cold War. You go to the Budapest Memo negotiations, which is in that clip you just played, which are high-stakes nuclear negotiations that reshape the world's security. And then I don't want to spoil the show too much, but we get into corruption scandals, we get into impeachment scandals, we get into obviously the largest land war in Europe since World War II. We get into,
Although
basically...
we spend much less time on the war than people
Correct.
expect, because it's not a story about the war. It's a story about the relationship between the United States and Ukraine over a much longer period of time.
Correct. But so when I'm thinking about the show and the narrative of the show, I'm thinking about, okay, there are these high octane, high pressure, high impact moments. And we know that there were people in the room that were seeing this unfold in the moment, and seeing all this play out. And so really what I tried to hone in on, and what I hope is reflected in the show as people listen, is yes, there's all this sort of very meaty, impactful material on all these ideas surrounding these two countries. But really what I hope the show hones in on is this remarkable series of events and the remarkable characters that were witness to it, that played a part in it. And some of that is reflected in our host, Nastia, who, Ben, I know you're very close with. Nastia brings a lot of firsthand perspective to this show to sort of provide what are sort of grounded first-person perspectives to a lot of these high-minded ideas. So when I'm thinking about this, I'm trying to think about character, story, what are the main plot points, knowing that we're going to have all the implications and all the themes. What are the scenes we can do? What are the pictures we can paint for the audience? And I think the show is a really good balance of that. I think it's a good mix of high-minded sort of diplomacy stuff and really grounded, boots on the ground storytelling.
So if I can bring out one of the central creative tensions in producing this show, I think nobody will disagree with me that in our editorial discussions, there was like from the beginning this tension between the desire to tell stories that are narratively compelling, centered around individuals, and then this desire to actually explain the larger history in which those individuals were operating. And you were the one who said we have to organize this around the real stories of real people. There has to be somebody whose story we're talking about at every time and telling. And Nastia was the one who would be saying, wait a minute, there's a whole background here of whether it's Russian imperialism or the post, Soviet development of the Ukrainian state, that like no one's going to be able to understand this story without appreciating. And if fair to caricature this debate as you're like the 60 Minutes guy and she's like the historian at a university with a pipe, right? And I think that the team did a just incredible job of integrating those two perspectives, which I'm not going to sugarcoat it, got heated a lot of times, and that really, but there's just an immense amount of history in this, told entirely through the sensibility of, it doesn't sound like a sort of didactic finger wagging lecture. And I'm just interested in, how do you, like, that strikes me as the hardest part of the show.
Right.
Nastia could write a 500-page book about these big historical themes. And how do you, like, what's the process of integrating that material into stories that are often about, like, one of the episodes is a woman whose husband, is a courageous journalist and doesn't come home one night because the corrupt president of Ukraine at the time has had him kidnapped and beheaded, right? Like, how do you tell those larger stories through the lens of individual people?
Yeah, great question.
And
individual
you're right, people who have to be alive in order to give us sound.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. And the sort of central tension within the show, which is all about these sort of misunderstandings, misalignments, whatever disagreements between the United States and Ukraine, we did live out a lot of that experience. And I say this with tons of respect and admiration for everyone on the team, but especially Nastia. But the show was constructed in this way of we were kind of trying to approach this very dense and difficult topic through different perspectives. We were just sort of looking at it through two different lenses. The combination of it was sort of relying on Nastia and the larger team to figure out, okay, what is the context that we need to illustrate here? What are the big scale ramifications we need to hit? And then I'm, to your point, was always just thinking about, okay, how do we get people that can illustrate this on the ground level and really in a first person sense? How can people illustrate these things through what they themselves had experienced and seen? And so if you're looking at the United States and Ukraine, there's no shortage of people that have stories like that, that can illustrate it. What we tried to find were the moments with real impact. And so to your point earlier about, so in our third episode, we featured the story you had just referenced of a woman whose husband had been kidnapped after sort of being critical of then Ukrainian President Leonid Kuchma. That was a story in which early on I was like, we need to talk about corruption in Ukraine. Corruption in Ukraine is a theme that carries across this relationship in various forms, in one shape or another over the entire time. What is a way in which we can illustrate not only what that corruption looks like and sort of feels like, but the impact it has? And so in our third episode, we feature a woman named Miroslava Gongadze, who is one of Ukraine's most accomplished journalists, who went through something just truly horrific with her family in the early 2000s because of the brave work that her and her husband were doing in covering corruption. And so that was a perfect example of what this show is trying to do, right? Of taking what is a key theme through this relationship and corruption and how it impacts the relationship, but finding someone that can tell you a story of not only how it happens and how it unfolds, but the impact of it. And so the sort of long answer to that, Ben, is you really got to get into the weeds on reporting. I mean, as you know, we interviewed 50 to 60 people for this show. The final product will have 20 to 25 people in it, which means we are casting a wide net and really, really drilling down on, okay, we got a good interview here. Can we get a great interview next week? And so what you hear in the show is the really sort of distilled, most pure, interesting anecdotes, insights, and perspectives that, we knew going in, this was going to be an ambitious task. This was going to be a tough show to assemble. But I think what you hear in terms of the immediacy and the impact of these, like I said, really high stakes, big picture sort of ideas, you hear it on a human level. You hear it on the tactile, how it affects individuals. And I think that brings the geopolitical stuff home a bit. I think it sort of gives this sort of a personal and character lens for stuff that could easily be kind of, easily be lost in the back pages of a history textbook. And so we really just try to drill down into character. What are the people that can highlight all these big, scary dynamics?
All right, so let's talk about episode 1, because that is actually the episode that is now available. And let's illustrate this. What is the sort of big-ass historical arc that we're talking about here, and what are the individual human stories that we're using to tell that story?
So the big-ass historical arc is centered around the very end of the Cold War. And so the show sort of opens in the late 80s when the Soviet Union is just beginning to fall apart. And the show is really about this moment in history in which the United States kind of has to reckon with all these post-Soviet countries that are now coming into, at least in the terms of Western context, coming into existence, right? So places like Ukraine that are getting their independence. And now the West has to figure out, okay, how do we relate to these people? What is our relationship? And how does that fit in with the new relationship we're also trying to form with Russia? And so what goes along with that is a ton of conversation and discussion about context and history. All this talk about the late 80s and early 90s, it's the end of history. It's this new chapter. But what does that mean for people in Ukraine who have been dealing with centuries of Russian imperialism and been dealing with the harsh, brutal consequences of that? The United States is ready for a new chapter by 1991. We were ready to turn the page on this chapter of history. Ukraine was still living with it. And so the show, the central tension there is the United States' sort of desire to move on and start something new, and Ukraine still reckoning with what they've been dealing with for centuries.
It's so interesting, because I would describe the central historical arc theme differently.
Let me hear it.
So I would have said, if you had asked me this question, it's about how the story is about how the American view of Ukraine as today back then was highly conditioned by our view of Moscow.
Correct.
We looked at the subject of Ukraine and Ukrainian independence through a lens of dealing with Moscow, and we thus had an ambivalence about, just as today, the president imagines that he can go and negotiate peace between Ukraine and Russia by talking directly to Vladimir Putin and leaving Ukrainians out of the conversation. We imagined, or George H.W. Bush was really reticent about the idea of Ukrainian independence because Moscow was a known stable actor, or so he imagined. And so it's really about how that American sense of dealing with Ukraine through Russia goes right back to the beginning, and the Ukrainian sense that the United States is an essential but unreliable ally goes right back to the beginning.
I think you're totally right, Ben. And one thing that's been interesting about seeing this episode now publish is, so this episode has been largely done in terms of the story for a couple months, which means we sort of have the same material that we've been revisiting and honing. What's really interesting is about it releasing now, we were listening back to it the other week for sort of quality control purposes before publishing, and we were shocked at how circular the whole thing was, about how we were listening back to this episode and we were like, goodness gracious, the exact same dynamics, the exact same ideas, the exact same tensions are being reflected literally at this moment. And I mean that literally in the past of, we were thinking about, the show, episode 1 is centered on this pretty cynical speech that George H.W. Bush gives. We were listening to and editing it just as Pete Hegseth was talking about the negotiations with the Russians and the fact that they weren't going to give guarantees to Ukraine, and they were sort of already giving up on all these conditions for the negotiations. And so we were seeing a parody play out as we were making it. And so the episode became more topical and relevant as like without us touching it, just because of the fact that we were at this moment where we're about to make the same decision on Ukraine.
I want to defend George H.W. Bush, though.
Please.
He was looking at an uncertain future. You know, you don't know what's going to happen in an uncertain future. Pete Hegseth has 30 years of history of Ukrainian-Russian relations to fall back on. And
Pete Hegseth needs this podcast.
He does. Okay, so who are the people who we're telling the story through their eyes?
So the characters that are reflected in the show? Do you want me to just spoil the whole season arc? I can do the whole thing.
No. Episode 1.
Episode 1.
Whose story are we telling?
So episode 1 features, like we said, President George H.W.'s key speech. That story is told through the lens of Fiona Hill, who is there in Moscow, who has some really, really fascinating stories.
Wait, are you telling me that my colleague, Fiona Hill, of the Brookings Institution, who will, by the way, be on the stage for the release
in an hour.
In an hour and 15 minutes from now. Are you telling me that her career did not begin with her congressional testimony in the Trump impeachment? That she actually existed before the whole drug deal?
Oh, absolutely. You know, it's funny. So we met Fiona Hill a couple months ago. We did a long sort of 90-minute interview with her in person at Brookings. And Donald Trump never came up once. It's because we were talking about everything else. I mean, you know, Fiona has seen every single thing that's happened in Moscow and between Moscow and the West. And so Fiona carries a perspective through a good chunk of the show. But she's just remarkable. And I think you'll actually hear a lot of that dynamic play out in this show. You'll hear familiar voices that are telling you unfamiliar stories and perspectives. You'll hear people that you would think would be there to talk about one thing. They're actually there to talk about another thing. And so I think the show will be really refreshing for even long-term sort of Russian-Ukraine followers, because you're going to hear novel insights. You're going to hear stories you never heard. You're going to hear familiar people telling unfamiliar tales. Fiona's just the beginning of it. I do want to say the back half of the episode features Tyler and Nastia, our two co-hosts, sort of talking about the lived implications of all this. It sort of brings the history into a contemporary first-person lens. And so I think one thing we can show is not just is there a long history there, but it's lived. It's still not only in a policy sense, it's being lived in the interpersonal sense, not just in Ukraine, here in the West as well. And so I think you'll hear, like I said, you'll hear a lot of these familiar stories, a little familiar voices, but hopefully in unfamiliar ways.
Yeah, I just want to say there's this section of the first episode that we actually had to have a discussion about whether to cut. And I'm really glad we didn't cut it. And it is about the respective celebrations of Independence Day in Ukraine and the United States, in which Tyler kind of asks Nastia, how do you celebrate Independence Day? And Nastia says, well, you know, I kind of put on a vyshyvanka, which is one of these embroidered shirts. And other than that, we go about our day because, you know, it's sort of bittersweet. Are we really independent yet? And, you know, 20% of Ukraine is occupied, and people have family living in those areas. And, you know, the project of independence is not complete. And that's you know, they don't react to Independence Day the way we do to July 4th. And there's a really compelling little back and forth about that becomes more compelling once the United States switches sides and decides that, you know, we're now on Putin's side.
Right.
All right. Well, we are going to continue this conversation on the Brookings stage. We have 15 minutes or 10 minutes really before I'm going to end us a little bit early. Max Johnston, you're a great American, and it's great to see your face, and I will see you later this morning.
Hey,
Stream Escalation and Fear and Loathing wherever you get your podcasts. That's all.
Max, before you go,
yes.
Is there a downloadable audio version, MP3 version of this series going to be available anywhere?
Yes. So I can follow up with individual links. So it'll go wherever you get podcasts, but we'll have episodes on our webpage as well. So we can totally pass that along.
I did find the webpage, but nothing downloadable.
I'll pass it along.
We can get you what you need, Mr. Roush. I hear through the grapevine Jonathan, that you have a new article out in the Atlantic.
I being the grapevine, yes, I do. It
Yes,
was
I hear from the grapevine, meaning you showed up live on my show and declared that you had a new article. That's the grapevine I'm talking about. Let it never be said that my reporting process is not transparent.
That's right. Yes, it's a pretty ambitious article that I've been working on for actually a few months, and I think it's a fairly important thing that I have to say, so I wanted to come on the show and tell you about it and plug it. It's something, actually, I worked through some of these ideas on this show in the very earliest days of this program. My title for it was It's Corruption, Stupid. Atlantic called it something like one-word description of Trump. The core idea is that what we are seeing now, as Ann Applebaum and others have noted, Larry Diamond has said this, is a regime change, not an administration change. It's a change in our system of government. And the article attempts to identify a change to exactly what, because a lot of what Trump's doing looks irrational from a purely self-interested point of view, like stripping the government of the very people that he will need to have a successful administration. And the answer is in a 100-plus-year-old idea of Max Weber, the great German sociologist, who coined the term patrimonialism for the world's oldest and most common system of government, which is when the state belongs to, is the personal property of the head of state. This is a form of government that can be seen in monarchy and in autocracy and also in tribes, in mafias, in street gangs. And here's what confuses people. It can be compatible, at least for a while, with democracy. You can have patrimonialism with democratic assent. That's what we see in Hungary, in India. It's what we used to see in Russia, actually, until Putin made the transition to full-bore classic authoritarianism. And it's what we see here. So the article is about what this system is, and it's critically about the essential vulnerability of patrimonialism, how you defeat it. And the answer is you go after it night and day, 24/7, nonstop, for its corruption, because it is everywhere and always definitionally corrupt.
All right. So you and I discussed this several weeks ago here, and I have a few questions. The first is, and I haven't read the piece yet, obviously, because I was only just made aware of it moments ago. The first is, how is patrimonialist corruption different from more garden variety corruption? The United States has had corrupt actors before, including in some high-profile, powerful positions. It's had dynastic families. What makes a patrimonial democracy different from any other corrupt democracy?
Corruption is, in patrimonialism, not incidental. It is not occasional. It is not the misbehavior of a few individuals. It's not even like Tammany Hall, where corruption serves the party, but not necessarily the person in charge of the party. Patrimonialism, corruption is endemic throughout the system because everything is linked to the personal interest and loyalty to the person in charge. That's its reigning principle. This is a point that you made so disturbingly and powerfully in your article on the dismissal of charges against Eric Adams. It's no longer possible to be a non-corrupt prosecutor in the Trump DOJ if your case interests the president. Even in principle, you can't be non-corrupt. That's different. Patrimonialism, it layers itself on top of democratic forms But instead of replacing them with classic authoritarian forms, building fake constitutions and bureaucracies and propaganda agencies and secret police and all of that, it simply says from now on, the principle in pick your agency is loyalty to the person in charge, as opposed to bureaucratic procedures. And once you've done that, you're definitionally corrupt.
And is there good examples of patrimonialist systems reverting to non-patrimonial democracy systems? You said the key to defeating them is the single-minded focus on corruption. But what are the examples of the reversion that you're looking to an anti-corruption message to accomplish?
I didn't do a tour d'horizon of that. I didn't have time. But one example, we hope, maybe, will be Ukraine, which was a patrimonial state until comparatively recently, and was invaded because of its efforts to become post-patrimonial, to become a bureaucratic procedural state, a modern state, in other words. A second, that's a phone, we'll ignore it. A second, possibly, though very fragilely, is Poland, which succumbed to patrimonialism under the Law and Justice Party. And I had a third at the tip of my tongue, but was distracted by that annoying phone, but I'll come up with it.
Yeah, so I was trying to think of examples of this. Law and Justice is a plausible example, though very much a work in progress. There is also some very solid attempts in Turkey, although they have all fallen short. Erdogan seems to me a classic example of this kind of patrimonialism. Although of a highly authoritarian variety. I couldn't think of very many good examples of this. And it seems to me that you described it as definitionally corrupt and it's one of its weaknesses, but I wonder if it's a weakness in performance, because corrupt systems will always underperform. But I'm not sure it's a weakness in democratic staying power, that, corrupt systems corrupt elections too, directly or indirectly. And I'm not certain that there's a great set of examples of, once you have a definitionally corrupt system, I'm not sure there are that many great examples of decorruption. There's, how Estonia turned into one of the least corrupt countries in the world. We would have to study have Thomas Ilves on, but I don't think it started as one of the deeply corrupt countries, right? I'm just trying to think of countries that used to be endemically corrupt and are now not.
So in the so first of all, no guarantees. We should be deeply, deeply worried that over the course of 4 years, Trump will snip so many of the tendons of bureaucratic proceduralism, the modern state, that we won't be able to recover, at least not fully. We do have the examples of the United States in the late 19th century, which had a lot of patrimonialism, especially at the state level and the political machines.
Huey Long,
a good example. And those were eventually extirpated, but it was a lot of hard work.
And by the way, the Huey Long machine, it took an assassination to begin dismantling it, right? I mean, it's not like the system worked or anything.
Well, it did not take an assassination in places like the Pendergast machine in Missouri and Tammany Hall in New York. It took a series of reforms and public outrage at corruption. So the big takeaway of my article is the Democrats are deer in the headlights, so are most of us. But when something works, it tends to be using the issue of corruption. It's an inherent deep vulnerability of patrimonialism. It's easy for the public to understand. The state has been stolen from you. You're being ripped off. And it has worked. It did work in Ukraine. It was working against Putin. That's why he had to get rid of Navalny. It worked in the United States in the progressive movement. It doesn't always work. It might not work, but it's right now, I think the takeaway of this article is that the opponents of MAGA should be focusing their strategy on a single, overriding, strategic, monomaniacal narrative: most corrupt president ever. That's it. Most corrupt ever.
I think there's a really important, so I agree with that. I think there's a really important codicil to it, which is to frame everything else in the language of corruption. When I was at a demonstration, a Ukraine demonstration on Saturday, and there were a bunch of signs, Ukraine is not for sale. You know, it's the same message as Stand with Ukraine, but it's framed in terms of, in a language that makes you think of Putin selling mineral rights in the occupied areas to Trump, right? It's a question of what image you're calling up. And I think, the sense of outrage that you can generate from Trump extorting mineral concessions from Zelensky is different from just saying, hey, Russians are killing Ukrainians and, they need weapons, right? And, framing everything in terms of the corruption, or not everything, but almost everything, having the major theme be the corruption, makes a lot of intuitive sense to me.
Yes, and two things not to do, which the anti-MAGA forces have been doing. One is forget about abstractions like rule of law, constitution, liberal democracy.
Yeah, all that shit.
No one cares. Talk about Trump's tariffs, Trump's rip-off tariffs for his fat cat buddies are adding $3,000 to the price of your car, and it's going into the pockets of etc. That's how you do it. So, and the second is, this is not a legal campaign. This is not dotting I's and crossing T's and making lots of intricate causal connections. We're not talking about, the Southern District of New York. This is just simple stories. One needn't be any too meticulous about all the particulars. Just do it. Corruption, corruption, corruption. That's the story.
We are going to leave it there. Jonathan Rausch, thank you for the surprise visit. I love this drop-in pattern that you're developing. And we are going to talk about this more and often. Folks, 10 o'clock. I don't think you can still register for the Brookings event to be there in person, but you can join us live electronically. And find the Escalation podcast wherever you watch your podcast or listen to your podcasts. We will be back tomorrow. See you then.